clot. So it's my pleasure this morning to welcome you to this first session of the new series on coping with, and this is around coping with panic after a diagnosis of a blood clot. And joining us today is our resident clinical psychologist, Professor Paul Bennett, who has researched and done extensive work in this area. Paul leads what we call the Regain programme for Thrombosis UK. And this programme has been running for just over 2 years. And during that time, he has developed quite a library of resources around supporting and tips and guidance around supporting anxiety, panic, and the psychological impact of thrombosis. He's also developed some film support and runs a one-to-one online clinical psychology session when individuals who are struggling to manage and getting back to normal after a blood clot are unable to access local clinical psychology support. These sessions are intended to be a sort of pre-runner to that, so we hope that they help, but if they don't, then the opportunity to refer or self-refer into one-to-one sessions is available, and these are free of charge, as are all of our resources. So I welcome you today, and I will now, one last thing, sorry. This session is being recorded, but you may have heard earlier, we will stop recording once Paul stops his presentation, and then it's open to discussion and questions and comments. That section will not be recorded, but the recorded session will then later go up onto the website and be made available to you and to others who may want to listen to Paul and benefit from his guidance and his experience and skills. So I will now pass over to Professor Paul Bennett to take the session on. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Jo, and hello, everybody. I have in front of me, I have opened the webinar chat and the Q&A part of Zoom. So there will be a period of time when, after I've done my little spiel, that I can answer, or we can sort of address some particular questions. But while I'm talking, if people want to ask questions, if you type them into the chat or the Q&A, then I can't guarantee to answer them as we're going through, but if I can incorporate them into my talk, then I will try and do so. So, welcome. Panic. Years ago, and I do mean years ago now, because as you can see, I'm getting old and white. We did some research looking at the experiences of people that had a thrombosis. And one of the things that became quite clear was that anxiety in general and panic in particular were quite widely experienced by people that had gone through this process. And so much so that one of the leaflets that you can access on the website still is called post-thrombotic panic syndrome. And that name isn't given by Smarty Pants me as a sort of clever way of talking about panic. This was actually one of the people that we talked to in some of that research. They actually called it post-thrombotic panic syndrome. And we thought it was such a good name that we sort of stuck with that. And partly because it emphasizes that feelings of panic are actually widely experienced to the point that people are actually giving it that label of post-thrombotic panic syndrome. And one of the interesting things, I use the word interesting a lot when I probably mean important, but one of the really interesting things for us was that when we thought about panic, we first of all thought it's likely to be most prevalent, most widely experienced by people that had had a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot, because a lot of the mechanisms in a clot, in panic, are related to breathing and so forth. But to my surprise, we found that it was equally experienced by people that had clots elsewhere in the body. So it is a, I hate to say it, but it is a familiar sort of experience for many people. So if you are experiencing feelings of panic as a result of the thrombosis, and in the months subsequent to that, sadly, you are not alone, but I hope you realize that it actually is quite a normal sort of process. And, you know, if you look at things that are likely to cause anxiety and panic in the, you know, as an experience or as an outcome of an event, you know, when something is really frightening, when it's really sudden, when it's unexpected, you know, as a psychologist, those are the things that I think are going to predict whether people are going to experience psychological problems, panic, anxiety, and so forth. And, you know, that is often the experience of people that have had a clot. It's unexpected, it's relatively sudden, maybe takes a while to come clear what it is, but the onset is usually fairly, you know, rapid. And people can get very anxious about having had that, all the implications and the thoughts of what about the future. So to me, panic is probably a relatively normal response. So what I want to talk about, first of all, is what is panic? Because if you understand the process of panic, then actually the interventions that we can do to manage panic make a lot more sense. And you can see the sort of logic of those. So really what I want to do in this talk from now on is, first of all, talk about what panic is, how it develops, and then to talk about how we can manage each of those different elements to actually learn to control and eventually prevent panic. And to be fair, most people are over time going to get a natural remission and natural reduction of panic over time, even if they experience it close or in the month or two following an event. But using some of the ideas and strategies, these can actually speed that recovery up and get people feeling better more quickly. So what is panic? Well, there's leaflets that actually describe this that you can get from the website at the moment. And I'm looking at one of them now as my crib sheet. But you can download them, so it'll give you some sense of what I'm talking about and as a reminder. But one of the key things about panic is that it is actually triggered by faulty breathing. And that is one of the key elements to the sort of what we call the panic cycle. But there is a trigger to that faulty breathing, because that faulty breathing is the beginning of a sort of what we call the fight-flight response, the body preparing to take action because it feels under threat. It's a sort of threat response, if you like, and it's the body beginning to overbreathe to get oxygen into the system to deal with a threat in a very ancient, you know, these go back to cavemen, these sort of responses. But what triggers that overbreathing? What triggers that feeling of threat? So the threat that we experience, that initiating anxiety, is in our head, it's our thoughts. And often it is a result of thinking back about what was the experience of when I had my clot. And some of that fear is engendered, some of that anxiety is engendered. More often for panic, it's often when you feel sensations that are similar to those sensations that you had at the time of a clot. It may be feeling slightly bit of pain in the chest. It may be feeling slightly short of breath. It may be you've got a pain in your calf or something. But it is the experience of a sensation that reminds you of the experiences you had, or we had, at the time of that scary event. In this case, being aware, being not having that knowledge that you are having a clot. As I say, it can be other things as well. It can be reminders of the clot. It can be going back to hospital. Some people, if they go back to outpatients and go back to the hospital where they were taken when they had a clot, even that can be sufficient to get people feeling anxious and beginning to get into that sort of panicky situation. So there are many precursors of you know, that initial, what's going on? And the critical thing is that these are typically benign events. They are sensations that we treat as symptoms. So I'm always think, for example, of somebody that's had a pulmonary embolism. If they walk up a flight of steps and get slightly out of breath, which frankly most of us do, rather than say, oh gosh, that was a bit quick going up those steps, it's like, oh, I'm getting a bit short of breath. Is this? And it's that initial anxiety, it's that initial, is something going on? Is something going wrong? That begins to start this sort of cycle, this process. So the first bit of a panic attack are those anxiety-provoking thoughts that something is going wrong, or remembering what it was like, or being in a situation that brings back those memories of anxiety and worry. What then happens is that the body goes into what you might call threat mode. And this is literally an ancient sort of thing we call fight and flight. It's called fight and flight. And the body is preparing to either literally fight the situation, fight some sort of initial threat, or to run away, flight, to run away from that threat. And this goes right back to, sounds a bit silly, but caveman, you know, the saber-toothed tiger leaps out, and you have to instantly move. You don't think, saber-toothed tiger, what do I do now? Should I? No. It's an instant response. You either hit it with something or run away. And that's part of the problem with panic, that that it's being initiated by that very rapid, very biologically ingrained sort of response. And the first thing that we begin to do when we're under threats these days is we begin to breathe, because we're getting oxygen into the body to help us prepare to physically manage a threat. And the problem is that that threat isn't physical anymore, but the body's still moving into that sort of threat mode. So if you look at when people begin at the very beginning of an episode of panic, you'll find that people are beginning to overbreathe. They're beginning to breathe a little bit more rapidly, a little bit, often more shallowly than as a response of trying to get oxygen into the body. It sounds good to have oxygen into the body. It's the breath of life. It's what keeps us going. You know. But one of the real issues is that oxygen, if we have too much oxygen in, actually becomes toxic. It causes problems, it causes sensations. And a number of things happen when we begin to overbreathe and get too much oxygen in. First of all, we may get some physical sensations. We may feel lightheaded, we may feel tingling. So we get a variety of unpleasant physical sensations. Secondly, because oxygen is, we're getting too much oxygen, what we also have is too little carbon dioxide in our blood. And carbon dioxide is what triggers the breathing. When we get too much carbon dioxide in our blood, the brain says, time to breathe, time to get rid of it. And if you have too much oxygen and too little carbon dioxide in the system, the brain's not getting that sensation about time to breathe. And so you begin to feel, I have to breathe. You're not getting that normal rhythm of breathing, that normal process. And despite the fact you've got too much oxygen in the system that's causing all these weird symptoms, making you feel lightheaded, you actually feel like you're short of breath. You feel like, I have to breathe. And so you get into this weird sensation of having to breathe, having to work at breathing at the same time as you're getting all these tinglings, all these feelings of lightheadedness going on, etc., etc. So that too rapid breathing, that over breathing, can actually trigger a whole range of problems that are actually nothing to do with clots, nothing to do with having new problems, and everything to do with that over breathing, that body preparing for something that feels threatening, but actually isn't really threatening. What then happens is that you begin to think all these symptoms are, oh gosh, these really are a problem. You know, I'm feeling a bit weird. My chest is hurting a bit more. I'm struggling to breathe. And all of that begins to convince you that you are really having problems. You're really having a further clot or something else is going on and so forth. So that those initial anxieties translate into these weird sensations that then confirm to you or the person having the panic that actually there is something really going on, which makes you breathe more heavily, that makes you struggle to breathe, and so on and so forth. So the whole thing gets out of control and is a really frightening experience. Now, the important thing to remember is that it's frightening. You know, panics are unpleasant and they can last a fair time, but actually, they're not actually harmful in the long term. They're unpleasant, difficult to cope with, but not actually harmful. And they do subside and they do calm down eventually. But, you know, we don't want to live through one of those because they're bloody awful, to be absolutely blunt. So, how do you manage these things? Well, as you can see, there are sort of various stages. The first stage are these thoughts. So the first part is managing those thoughts. The breathing is a second element that is contributing to those feelings of panic. So you can manage the panic. And then there are sort of the breathing rather, and then there are other things that you can do that can sort of add to that we can talk about. So the key to managing panic, and I'm going to talk about each of these things in a little bit more detail in a minute, but just to give you a flow. The first thing to remember is that if you're getting these sensations, you've probably had them before. You've probably had the sensations in your chest or your leg before, and it turned out not to be anything too radical. If it really is a very unusual, very scary sensation, then you probably need to take action. But if you're at that point of thinking, oh my God, is something going on? You know, am I having a problem? Then that probably means that there's time to bring in some of these other sort of calm down processes. So the first stage is to just give yourself time, 5-10 minutes to say, right, I'm going to assume that what I'm experiencing is panic and anxiety, not having another clot, not having another crisis. And if I delay 10 minutes, it's not really going to make much difference to the outcome of this, because by the time I've either got to hospital, I've called for an ambulance, I've done all the other things, you know, you really are taking a long time. So to delay for 10 minutes or so at most, if you are having symptoms that you're not quite sure what's going on, could be panic, could be something more serious, then, you know, give yourself that reassurance, I've got time to enact some of these processes. Next thing to do during this 10 minutes, what do? The first thing is to try and give yourself reassuring, calm down messages. Been here before, I've had these sensations, they're scary, but they're not actually evident, they're not something radically happening. Second thing in a sort of sequence is to bring your breathing under control. And there are some really simple ways of slowing your breathing down, of calming that breathing down. And that really is the core of what you need to be doing to control the panic. Above and beyond that, there are some more general relaxation things that you can do that we can talk about. But the key is give yourself calm down messages, manage some of that breathing, and then if you've had time, if you've learned some other relaxation strategies, learn to sort of bring a more general relaxation in, because that can speed that sort of recovery process up. It slows everything down. And if you can do those three, they sound simple, but in the reality, when you're panicking, they're not that simple. But if you can do those relatively simple sort of processes, then that can actually help manage panic attacks. And the critical thing is to do them early. You know, the earlier you do this, it's it's easier to manage a panic attack in those early stages when you catch yourself I'm getting a bit anxious, than trying to do these when you have a full-blown panic attack. Full-blown panic attacks can be managed, but it's more difficult once you get to that stage. So as soon as you realize, hang on, I'm beginning to get anxious, that's the time to get the breathing under control, get these thoughts under control, and maybe do the general relaxation. So as I say, the first stage is to perhaps think back to times when you've had these sensations before and it turned out that they were not a reclot, they were a consequence of your anxiety, of that exaggerated concern, that focusing on the symptoms, the sensations that are going on, rather than actually I hate to say it, but a genuine another clot, etc. And to some extent, people say, well, how do I know? Well, one of the things that happens is that over time you learn what is natural. People might get a little bit of a pain in the lung because of the sort of recovery of the lung or a scar, that you can begin to say, yeah, it's not pleasant, but it's a normal part of my recovery process. It's not a sign of a further problem. So part of this being able to reassure yourself, to be fair, is to learn what is a benign experience for you. I'm not saying it's a pleasant, but it's not indicative of a big problem coming up. So to give yourself that reassurance, right? What I need to do some breathing, do some relaxation. And if that then turns out not to stop the discomfort or get everything under control, then to think about seeking help, talking to somebody else or whatever. So first thing is to give those calm down messages. Second is to do some very, very simple breathing exercises. Now, I can't see you, so I'm going to trust that you're doing this, but I'm going to do this live and in the studio, but I'm going to move my camera slightly so that you can see my chest and me breathing. So what I'm doing is putting my hand on my chest and my hand on my stomach. And this is a good way to find out where and what's going on with your breathing. So if you could do the same, just relax back a little and put your hand on your chest and your hand on your stomach. And start just doing a little bit of, sounds dreadful, some heavy breathing. And try and work out which of those hands is moving. Is it the hand on your chest or is it the hand on your stomach? Chest, stomach. Okay, don't do too much over breathing or else you're going to be panicking, causing a panic attack. But just try and become aware of when you do that slightly exaggerated breathing. Is it your chest moving or is it your stomach moving? Because those are actually quite important in determining what's going on and how to manage what's going on. So for those of you that your stomach came out as you were breathing in, good news, that's the right way to breathe. For those of you whose chest came out, whose hand on your chest moved most when you were breathing, well, that's good news as well, because that's not the right way to breathe, but you can find out what's happening. It gives you something to sort of work on and something to manage. So why is this so important? Well, there are two ways of breathing. There are two sets of muscles that control our breathing. The first is what's called the intercostal muscles, the muscles in our chest. And the second is a big muscle at the bottom that splits your body in two, called the diaphragm. And when you breathe with the diaphragm, what that means is you're pulling air right down into the bottom of the lungs, and that allows that oxygen to be got rid of, and the carbon dioxide to come in a little bit when you're panicking. Normally it allows the opposite. If you're breathing from the top of your lungs, what that means is that you're actually blowing off carbon dioxide and just bringing in more and more oxygen and adding to those feelings of panic that you're having. So the critical thing when we're trying to manage breathing is to do two things. It's to slow the breathing down, and it is to try and do that what we call diaphragmatic breathing, not to breathe with your chest, but to breathe with the diaphragm, to really bring the air right down into the bottom of the lungs. So you're getting that sort of nice rhythm of breathing sort of triggered. I can't tell you how to breathe with a diaphragm. If you do it already, you're lucky. If you don't, then there's no trick. It's just practice. But if you are, what I'm going to suggest is that you practice doing a very simple breathing strategy. And just if you're doing that, then you almost exaggerate that by pushing your stomach out as you breathe in. Because one of the sad things about breathing in with the diaphragm is your stomach comes out because you're pushing the contents of your gut a little bit down. So it's not good for the marvelous posture if you're on parade, but it is the best way to breathe. So there's a really simple breathing strategy that you can do. And that's called counting the square, or other people have got similar names for it, but it's basically breathing to a rhythm, breathing to a simple sort of strategy. And the idea is that you imagine a square or whatever, and you breathe in a series of ins and outs according to a square. So you start at the top and you breathe in and count to 4. Breathe in, 1, 2, 3, 4. Critically, you don't just breathe out, you hold 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out, 1, 2, 3, 4, and hold 1, 2, 3, 4. The 1, 2, 3, 4 doesn't really matter if you find you can get that nice rhythm. If you find it's difficult to do a hold for 4, then do it for 3 or whatever. It needs to be comfortable. But the critical thing is that you are doing a controlled breathing in, you are breathing out, sorry, you're holding, then you breathe out, and then you hold. So you're slowing the whole breathing process down. And if you can do that, as soon as you begin to realize that the breathing is getting out of control, then that is a really good way of bringing that breathing down. And ideally, you're doing it with the diaphragm. You're doing that nice diaphragmatic breathing. And if you can get that breathing under control, you're 75% of the way to controlling a sort of panic, maybe even more. It's that important. And to be honest, it's that simple because the breathing is what's driving the whole thing. So getting the breathing under control is pretty much the core of what you're doing. So it's worth practicing, but it's such a simple strategy that it doesn't take much practice, but it's remembering to do it. And that is the critical thing. As soon as you get those sensations, as soon as you get the panicky feelings, don't think, am I breathing too quick or what's going on? Just assume that you are. Breathe in, 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out, 2, 3, 4. Hold 2, 3, 4. And if you look at all these sort of meditation things, it's breathing through the left nostril, out through the, doesn't matter a damn how you do that breathing, whether it's with your mouth, whether it's with your nose. The critical thing is that it's slow and controlled. So those are step 1, is to do that, calm down. These sensations are probably just me panicking. I've had them recovering from the clot that I've had. Do the breathing. That will bring everything down, make everything a little bit more rational. Because one of the things when you're in the middle of a panic attack is your thoughts are not rational. So if you get calm, it's easier to bring those sort of rational thoughts on. That is probably the key to controlling a panic attack. Now, there are other things that you can do on top of that that take more practice that you may or may not decide to do. And one of those is a more general relaxation. It's bringing that whole sort of body into a state of relaxation. And that takes practice. It takes a little bit of time, and I can talk about that. But, you know, if you can just do those calm down thoughts and that breathing, that's a long way to sort of managing the process. And it doesn't take that much practice. It's just remembering to do it and getting the confidence to do it. So I'll talk a little bit about relaxation in general, because we talk about it in the leaflet, and we've got some instructions about how to do it and so forth. If you think right back to the beginning of the talk, when I was saying that panic is about the body moving into that dealing with the threat mode, fighting or flighting or running, then obviously the breathing is that getting the oxygen in, and then it's fueling the muscles. It's fueling a sort of, you know, physiological reaction with the body getting tense and preparing to either run away or literally to deal with the situation. So the breathing will bring that down. It will stop that precursor. But if you can do some relaxation as well, that will help dampen that final stage and bring a state of relaxation. And that can add to the breathing. This takes practice. It's not something you can necessarily do immediately, whereas the other two strategies I think you can evoke pretty much straight away. So how do you do relaxation? How do you learn relaxation? Some of you may have come, you know, a lot of people have come across relaxation in other walks of life. It's no different, you know, things like, you know, childbirth, stress in general or whatever. You know, relaxation is a pretty well, pardon me, a pretty well taught sort of process. So apologies if I'm repeating stuff that you know, but for those that don't, the goal of relaxation is that you are as relaxed as possible in real life. So if you're feeling a bit panicky, if you've walked up a flight of stairs, and you're getting a little bit of those sensations, you may be with people, you may be doing things. You know, what you don't want to do is take yourself out and sit down on a, you know, 20 minutes listening to whale music or relaxing. You want to be as relaxed as is appropriate to the situation you're in, without necessarily people even being aware that you're doing the relaxation. So relaxation starts, if I'm honest, by doing exactly that, learning to do it under ideal circumstances. But the goal is that you can relax to order. You know, you catch yourself getting tense, which will be happening if you're getting panicky. It's relaxing that so that, as I say, other people might not even notice it, but you are physically relax. But to be able to do that, it does take practice, and you know, you may decide it's worth it, you may decide it's not. So if you are going to do that, the critical thing is to learn to relax under ideal circumstances to start with. And if you go to the website, we've got some little leaflets on what we call relaxation, or the, as I said before, post-thrombotic panic syndrome. And they have links to some relaxation instructions that will talk you through that. If you see me individually, I'll give you some links to other relaxation instructions as well, because you know, there's plenty of them around. As I say, the ideal is that you practice under ideal circumstances. And what that involves is either sitting in a nice, comfortable chair, or ideally just lying on your bed or something like that. Headphones on, so you're not going to be disturbed, and listening to the relaxation instructions. And what the instructions do is talk you through a process of tensing and then relaxing the muscles systematically through the body. Tense, relax, tense, relax. And the idea of the tension isn't that you're getting really high levels of tension, but you're getting enough tension to be able to relax away. So you're learning to relax and get rid of that excess tension. Takes a little while to be able to do it effectively. Doesn't matter when you practice, the ideal, but don't do it just before you go to bed. because you're not trying to get to relax to go to sleep. You're trying to relax to learn to relax to order when you're in the real world. So if you do choose to go down this route, maybe a fortnight of daily practice of the relaxation. If you do it every 3 or 4 days, it's frankly a waste of time because you're not getting that repetition. You're not getting that sort of relaxation being ingrained. So if you are going to practice relaxation, it's worth having that commitment to do it on a regular basis for roughly a fortnight or so until you've really got that sort of process of relaxation, tense and relax. Once you can do that to order, once you're confident at doing that, then it's really a case of now moving into the real world. And the first way of doing that is just simply to learn to relax, to practice relaxation at times during the day, when you're in the office, when you're at work, when you're watching TV, when you're driving your car, learning to sort of bring that, any tension that you have, not doing the tension bit now, but just learning to relax, 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 and going systematically through the body. And then when you can do that, then it's like using those relaxation strategies when you're having those episodes of panic. So you get into a flow of reassuring words, get the breathing under control, and then bring in that sort of wider body relaxation process as a sort of system that you do. As I say, it's a little bit of sort of adding the icing to the cake, but it can make a difference if you do that. So it's sort of worth, thinking about that at least. But the breathing is the core sort of process. Other things that you can do, I mean, things like exercise and all sorts of other things can reduce the chances of panic because other sort of processes, but that is the core of it. Get that thoughts under control, get your breathing under control, and if you want, add that extra of bringing the relaxation in.